Alright, I got my hair looking somewhat decent. I messed up my beard, so I shaved it. And I'm feeling like I'm at one of the lowest points of my entire life. So, let's do another backwards marathon on one of my favorite bands of all time, Death. This one should be nice and sweet, as it's only 7 albums, so I hopefully won't be taking up too much of your time this time around. And yeah, let's get right into it in chronological order, of course, with what is arguably one of the first death metal albums of all time, with Scream Bloody Gore. Yes, it is between this and Possess Seven Churches as the first death metal album. There's arguments for both. I'm not here to debate that, I just know this is a great album. It's obviously the most pure, the most raw, the most savage death album ever made. And it is the perfect blueprint for what death metal would become. And you have such legendary songs off this album that are still played by so many cover bands, Death to All, and yeah, it's a perfect representation of what extreme music could be. And if it wasn't for this album, imagine how many bands would not exist. And yeah, the more I listen to it, especially over the years, it is one of the best death metal albums ever made. In fact, you can make the argument that here's 7 of the best death metal albums ever made. But how do they rank? Well, I'm going with Scream Bloody Gore at an A. Next up is Leprosy. And if you've seen other things that I've said before, like in particular my 1988 top 10 albums, or if you've seen me cover this in other outlets, you will know that I consider Leprosy to be the greatest death metal album ever made. Compared to Scream Bloody Gore, it is with better production, I feel better songwriting. It's still raw, it's still aggressive, but you can just tell that the band is getting tighter and tighter on Leprosy. The lyrics are more thought-provoking rather than just being horror-based. And you can really hear in Shock that he wants to go a little bit more progressive and experimental, even though this album is pure death metal. Especially when you go back and listen to it, you can see how he naturally progressed the way that he did. And what an album cover. I mean, especially for this time period. What kind of metal band would put pink on an album cover? Well, Chuck did. And it is one of the most legendary death metal artworks of all time. So yeah, gotta keep it nice and sweet here. My favorite death metal album of all time is getting a D. I'm kidding, of course. It's getting an S. That is followed up by another one of my favorite album artworks of all time with Spiritual Healing. Now, this also goes less into the horror aspects and more of like a real world theme throughout the entire album. You can definitely tell by the artwork, it's about religious people trying to provoke people into giving them money or freely following them, and sometimes not freely following them. And it covers a lot of great other topics as well too. The production continues to get a little more fine-tuned, and I really just gotta say it, I don't think there is a single bad death album. No. Like I said already, 7 of the best death metal albums ever made. Sometimes it goes into different subgenres. But yes, everything that Death ever made is classic. But there's something I gotta put on the bottom. It's not a bad album. It's a fantastic album. It's just the album I go back to least. I don't know why, it just is. And for that reason, I'm giving it a B. Human is up next, and this is the first of 4 albums that really showcase the progressive side of what Death would become. This is probably the most primal of all 4 of those, and you can kind of hear it in Spiritual Healing as well too, but Human is where it really started to get over the top with amazing jaw-dropping musicianship and songwriting and twists and turns that you will never see coming, especially on the first listen. And of course, when you got Sean Reiner and Paul Masvidal on this album, you're gonna get that progressive death metal flavor to it, especially when they went on to create Cynic after this. The production on this album and the following album are arguably the weakest, and I say that even with Scream Bloody Gore and all of its raw prowess, but with Scream Bloody Gore, it is something to fine-tune, and they did. Whereas with these, I feel it's a little bit of a step back, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next album as well too. But with that in mind, all of the songs off this album are fantastic and absolutely worth your attention. And yeah, I'm giving it an A. Human is up next, and the first of 2 albums featuring Gene Hoglan on drums. And this album might be the weakest production of them all. This is the And Justice for All of Death's discography when it comes at least to production, because the bass is not really there. You can kinda hear it. But for some reason, it is completely drowned out, and there's no reason for it. Although, with that said, the songs are so great off this one, and it's funny considering the last track on this album, The Philosopher, is based so much, supposedly, on Paul Masvidal and his, well, high opinion of himself. Especially when you know that going in, it hits just a little different. I do feel all of the songs off this album are fantastic, and it's just a great fun listen, but I can understand how the production can be a little grating. So with that in mind, I'm giving it a B. Symbolic. A lot of people consider this to either be the start of Chuck's end when it comes to death, when they decided to get rid of the death metal growls and start to replace it with more black metal screams. Still very death metal, but very much it's progressive death metal with more black metal screams, which you wouldn't normally expect, especially when Symbolic came out. But I do think it is a sheer masterpiece of an album. It arguably has the best fine-tuned songwriting of everything that's going on. And by fine-tune, I do mean over-the-top, outrageous, and stunning musicianship, songwriting, production, everything that goes into it. And how can you not love that album cover? It is so legendary, and for good reason. And one of my favorite death metal songs of all time is on this album, and you would think it would be the title track Symbolic, and that's up there too. But actually, it's a bit of a deeper cut, Thousand Eyes. Yeah, that's the song that hits me. And everything from that intro to the do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Like, that's one of my favorite death metal riffs of all time. And it takes me back to that Leprosy era as well, too. I mean, obviously, not as death metal, not as savage. But it's like you take something off Leprosy and you make it a little more sophisticated. And you get Symbolic. So, yeah, with that in mind, I am giving it an S. And finally, the most controversial album in Death's discography. Not even written to be a Death album. This was meant to be for Control Denied, which was the project that sadly never got the recognition it deserved due to Chuck's passing. But it is an album that, especially when you go back and you listen to bands over the last decade, and even now, so many progressive death metal bands hold this album into sheer regard. And that is, of course, The Sound of Perseverance. This was my very first Death album. And of course, you got Richard Christie, one of my favorite drummers of all time, playing on this album. And one of the most legendary sounds of all time, his China cymbal, that's Sabian B8. Which, if you're not familiar with cymbals, that is one of the beginner series cymbals by the company Sabian. But it has one of the most legendary sounds out there. And of course, speaking just on drums alone, this is the most bombastic, crazy, and awe-inspiring drum performances in all of death metal. Some might not say it's the best work. Some could consider it to be sloppy and all over the place, because it does go all over the place, but it fits so perfectly. And especially when you saw Richard Christie play live, he hit everything on there note for note. So it might be a lot mashed in together, but it hits so hard and it fits so perfect for the music. Of course, you also have Painkiller, which I just talked about in my Best of 1990 albums, where I talk about the original song Painkiller by Judas Priest. And here in Chuck's take, while not Halford, it is Chuck Schuldiner. And it works so perfect. Yeah, this is an album that I love from start to finish, and it just doesn't get much better than that. I can understand if you're not big on progressive death metal or technical death metal, you're not going to love this album. And there's a lot of people who do consider this to be the weakest album, and I understand why. But for me, it is without a doubt an S. Give me just a second here, and I'm going to put this in correct order. Be right back. And we're back with everything in order, so why don't I talk about all 7 albums? Starting at what is for me personally at the bottom is Spiritual Healing, followed by Individual Thought Patterns. Followed by that in the A ranking you have Human, and then Scream Bloody Gore. And then in the S tier, which I can imagine is going to piss a lot of people off because, hey, you're only supposed to have one album in S. It's my list, so I don't care. You have Symbolic, The Sound of Perseverance, and my favorite death metal album of all time, and of course my favorite death album of all time, Leprosy. So that's my list, and my personal feelings behind it. If you like it, if you want to tell me how wrong I am for my own feelings, or if you just want to give your own ranking, do it down below in the comments. Of course, like, comment, subscribe, notification bell, all that stuff, if you enjoy what I do. And until the next Backwards Marathon, interview, review, list, or anything else I decide to put up on the Heavy Debriefings YouTube channel, this is Josh Runquist for Heavy Debriefings saying, see ya.